Bulka, welcome to the Sabby and Jaybe show. I am Jaybe. I'm one of your hosts. So good to see all of you are here on this Thursday evening. I am one of your hosts, JB. What's up, Sabs? Good to see you.
What's going on, JB?
All right, good to see all of you here today with us. As you guys can tell, this is going to be a very special educational stream. So make sure to get your pens and paper ready because you're going to learn today. You're going to learn today. All right? Now, just to let you guys know, the Sabby and JB show is every single Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can also find Sabby on this very same channel on Fridays at 6 p.m. Eastern. Also, Sabby, you also have a show on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m., right?
That's right.
All right. So make sure to also tune in to her a little bit later this evening on her channel. You can also see me every single Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sundays on the JB show here on RBN. You can also find me on my channel on Tuesdays at 2, where I do regular streams, news, and interviews. So you guys can find me on there as well. Now, if you have not already, go ahead and go to our Substack. You guys can go to revolutionaryblackout.substack.com so that you guys can get email notifications whenever we go live. So just to let you guys know, you guys can do that there. And as per usual, excuse me, whenever we have guests, I like to make sure that we get to the guests before we get to the people in the comments. But just like to let you guys know, you guys can also, we do a fundraiser for our graphics designer, Aaron. So if you guys would like to, you guys can go to Venmo at Revolutionary Blackout, or you guys can go to Cash App, $ Mutual Aid Forever for that. And I will also get to some house cleaning stuff in a little bit. But right now we have Noah Krejcivik and Eddie Liger-Smith from Midwestern Marx. My brothers, good to see all of you professors.
Great to see you too, JB. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, great to be here, brother. Thank you so much for having us on. We love you guys. Everybody at RBN, we listen to you guys all the time. So awesome being here. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so very much for coming. For everybody in the audience, this is where we're going to be talking about today. What capitalists don't want you to know? Midwestern Marx joins. Why do we have Fidel Castro, Mao Zedong, and Jaybe Stalin? That's going to be on our photos. Well, what we're talking about? We're talking about the misconceptions. We're spilling the real tea on socialist leaders, right? So, Noah, Eddie, as instructors for Midwestern Marx, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about people like Stalin and Mao? If you want, we can actually, divvy this up into each category for like Stalin, Mao, Castro, and others, if you would like to. But what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you hear about them, and that is easily debunked just through history alone?
I would say, without getting into any specifics right away, the main misconception is the idea that they purposefully starved people, that Mao and Stalin were such evil bad guys that they hoarded all the grain for themselves and didn't starve people on purpose, right? That's not what happened. Now, Russia and China at the time of the revolution were semi-feudal countries. They were not highly industrialized. They didn't have industrialized agriculture. That was something that needed to be developed and was developed very quickly by the socialist economy. So famines in Russia and in China, feudal China and feudal Russia, had been rampant for years under capitalism or a form of it's basically a mixture between capitalism and feudalism was the kind of mode of production they had. So what socialism did by industrializing agriculture is got rid of those famines forever. Now, there were some, famines in the early years of China and Russia, but the reason there hasn't been any famine since is because of the agricultural policies that were taken by the socialists. Now, like in the case of the Soviet Union after the revolution, not only were they not industrialized, but they were put under economic sanctions by the West. They had regime change efforts by, I believe, 9 different Western countries in the few years after the revolution. They had to divert a lot of their economy towards military spending to prepare for the incoming fascist invasion from Germany. So there was less money that they could put towards agriculture and food. So this led to shortages in some areas, but it wasn't shortages that were caused by Stalin because he was an all-powerful dictator who felt like starving people. They were shortages caused by the material conditions, which were conditions that the socialist economies inherited from the economies previous, right? This is what we know from Marxism and historical materialism. You can't just invent socialism tomorrow. We can't just create a utopian society tomorrow. It needs to be built from the society that we've inherited. So that's what the Soviet Union and China were doing when they experienced these famines. And then, of course, that's been taken by Western propagandists like the Black Book of Communism authors, for example, and they extrapolate from data, create the biggest death tolls that they possibly can, and then say all of these people died because of the evil actions of Stalin and Mao.
Yeah, just to give a little. Oh, I'm sorry, Eddie.
No, I'm done.
I have this terrible habit of interrupting Eddie, by the way.
I'm done.
Just to like add a little like to sort of paint the picture of what Eddie's talking about. The famine he's referring to happens around in the early 30s in the Soviet Union. And in 1932, 80% of the agriculture was done with hand implements. You know, the hammer and sickle. That's because the peasantry there were literally still using sickles. And it took the industrialization and collectivization and the free use of tractors for the collective farms, what they called the kolkhozs, to overcome that limitation. And that, you know, that just takes time. But what I really focus on is how these narratives all get proliferated, because if you listen to what Eddie was just saying, there's sort of a little factual kernel, and then it's spun into this wild narrative where you suddenly, you know, we can't try socialism or else Stalin's gonna come and eat your babies and their babies and their babies and all that, you know.
Yeah,
always it takes one thing, divorces it from all of the sort of history that creates it, and then blames it on some sort of evil intent.
Gotcha.
So
one of the things that I wanted to bring up, and a lot of times people talk about how Stalin is this totalitarian, autocratic ruler. But in fact, I want to show people something. And Sabby, remember when we talked about this and I brought it up to you. Now, here is proof that Stalin was actually a democratic ruler. And this is from the CIA themselves. Oh, he's looking now. We're about to get into it, people. All right. So this is from the CIA, CIA.gov, right? All right. This is from the Central Intelligence Agency, right? And March 2nd, I think it's 52 or 56, something like that. So here's what it says. The number one, it says, even in Stalin's time, there was collective leadership. The Western idea of a dictator within communist setup is exaggerated. Misunderstandings on that subject are caused by a lack of comprehension of the real structure and organization of the communist power structure. Stalin, although holding wide powers, was merely the captain of a team, and it seems obvious that Khrushchev will be the new captain. However, it does not appear that any of the present leaders will rise to the stature of Lenin and Stalin, so it will be safer to assume that developments in Moscow will be along the lines of what is called collective leadership, unless Western policies force the Soviets to streamline their power organization. The present situation is the most favorable from the point of view of upsetting the communist dictatorship since the death of Stalin. But here's the thing. They still call it dictatorship, even though they admitted that it was collective leadership.
So where does that come from then? Like, where does that statement that it was a dictatorship, like who started that?
There's competing theories on this. Really, anyone who's written a paper in school knows that you need to use primary sources, right? So whenever we look for primary sources on things like this, or like the famines that Eddie was talking about, we go back to a few central places. One is a British intelligence agent named Robert Conquest, who was literally in their misinformation department. Another is Seymour Hurst, the guy that the Rosebud guy, right? From the movie, I forget what it's called. But he was a huge media magnate in the U.S. and a fascist. And not just, he was a mean guy. Like, he was the media liaison to the Nazi Party. He paid Mussolini to write articles for him. Like, he was a fascist. Citizen Kane, thank you.
Got you.
So that's one of the other primary sources. But a lot of it is a sort of misunderstanding of the term dictatorship of the proletariat, right? So the way Marxism views all of society, all of it, is as a contradiction. It's a contradiction in the process of overcoming itself, right? So you have the old decaying part of it, the bourgeois side, which was progressive in the past. And then you have the nascent progressive part of it that moves things forward, the proletarian side. Which class in society has power dictates to the other class, right? Or other classes, has a democracy within its own class, but dictates to the rest. So a democracy of the bourgeoisie is what we could call the U.S. And they take this term dictator and then run with it. And, a typical media spin about any enemy of our ruling class. They're always evil in some way. And Stalin is the perfect example. I mean, there's a really, really good paper showing how democratic Stalin in particular was by Grover Furr. He's a modern historiographer on the Stalin period of the Soviet Union, called Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform, if anyone's interested. But the 1936 Constitution movement, which was spearheaded by Stalin, was the most democratic sort of way of implementing politics that the world had seen at this time, right? Because for the first time in history, it was the masses that had the sort of democracy of the working class, and all they needed to repress or dictate to was the small minority of the old exploiting class, right? So that they couldn't return.
I think to answer the question more directly, what the Bolsheviks and the Marxists were calling the early stages of socialist governance are dictatorship of the proletariat. Being that under capitalism, you have a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. We both know that, we have two different parties in this country, the Democrats and the Republicans. Who do they serve, though? The economic ruling class. It's a dictatorship of the capitalist class. Whatever the capitalist class says goes. So to combat that, you have a dictatorship of the proletariat, which, yes, is called a dictatorship, but really what it is a dictatorship by the masses. It's mass rule. And in the early stages of socialism, the state apparatus needs to be used to suppress the counter-revolutionaries, the imperialists, the capitalist class who aren't going to go down without a fight. And that's where the term dictatorship of the proletariat comes from, and seizing the state apparatus and using it to benefit the workers rather than the capitalists and create a true democracy.
Yeah.
So recently,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just a quick question. Recently, I know I saw there was a little bit of criticism over this. Recently, I saw that Garland Nixon said that Stalin was fascist. And I think it was, I can't remember if it was Noah or Eddie. It was one of you that pushed back on that. And not everybody that watches the show has Twitter. So could one of you explain to people why that is not necessarily the case?
Yeah, I mean, he just doesn't meet the description of a fascist. And there's this book called The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, which was heavily funded and sponsored by the CIA, which basically argued that communism and fascism were the same thing. And this book came out, I believe, in the 60s or 50s, so after World War II had ended. And they tried to push this idea that the communists who defeated the Nazis were the same as the Nazis, even though, of course, the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany were mortal enemies, and 80% of German casualties in World War II were dealt by the Soviet Union, who lost 27 million people fighting the German Nazis. So to say that these two were just the same thing is quite ridiculous, but that's the narrative that's been pumped out by the CIA and blasted out over mainstream media and the systems of education that we have in the capitalist world. But I mean, not only did Stalin beat the Nazis, but if you read Michael Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds, you'll see there's no real similarities between the governments or the economic policy. Hitler rose to power on the backs of multinational corporations and business interests within Germany who bankrolled his rise to power. And one of the first things that both he and Mussolini did was sent their brown shirts or stormtroopers to kill communists, socialists, labor leaders, and bust up unions. So it basically allowed a corporatocracy to take power in Germany, the same way that a bunch of finance capitalists tried to do here in America with what's known as the business plot. They basically tried a fascist coup against FDR. That's basically what happened in Germany. They were in a state of economic crisis after World War I, and the fascists won out, whereas the communists were killed and suppressed. But in the Soviet Union, it wasn't the case. The workers were able to seize power in a time of economic crisis, and they invested in all these policies of industrialization, collectivization of agriculture, increased literacy from like 17% to 99%, vastly increased wages, vastly increased access to healthcare. These weren't things that happened in Germany. In Germany, basically, things got worse for the working class almost in every way. There were some things that Hitler would throw, like some populist things that he would do to try and win the workers to his side, which is why they were called the National Socialist Party in the first place. He was just trying to capitalize on the popularity of socialism. But in terms of governance, Stalin and Hitler couldn't have been more different.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple other Stalin era policies. Gender equality, right? Women were part of the working class, and there were things like community laundries and cafeterias set up where all of this traditional women's work at the time was done by everybody in order for women to go to work or school. They set up a giant education system, began sending party cadre around. This was a mostly illiterate country before the revolution, right? If you couldn't get to a school, they would send people to your house, to your village, wherever, to make sure you were taught how to read. And that is giant. My grandmother remembers the party people coming and teaching her how to read as a little girl. And she grew up in southern Kazakhstan, by the way. Not only that, anti-racism. Huge. There were laws against racist organizing, anti-Semitic organizing. There were Soviets or workers' councils, that's what the word Soviet means, set up to promote the unique interest of all the different ethnic groups within the Soviet Union in the government. It's just huge. Everything we talk about wanting these days, the Soviet Union was actively implementing.
Yeah. One of the things I want to ask you, was I mistaken for saying that Stalin was somebody who was democratic? Because Negras Tormenta says, my God, Stalin was democratic. Please, we shouldn't buy into Western propaganda, but saying Stalin was democratic is ridiculous. Was I ridiculous for saying that?
No, not at all.
That's true. He wanted to implement more democracy before he died.
A lot of this boils down to the creation of preconceptions. And where does that come from? That comes from history. History is what builds the present, right? And in our country specifically, we have this long history of our ruling class pushing anti-communism because communism historically is the only real threat to their power, whether we call it communism or not, you know? I mean, we can just look at how the Soviet Union was set up and disprove the notion. Just to give you a broad overview, in the early days of the revolution in Russia, there was the dictatorship of the proletariat, and this included only the city working class. The problem was most of the Soviet Union was peasants, right, in rural areas, people like my grandparents. And when Stalin is elected, because he was always elected, people voted yes or no for him, right? This all changes. We get the 36th Constitution, and the peasantry is included into the dictatorship of the proletariat. So they have all the same rights as everybody else. They're voting. But beyond that, the way the government was structured was largely based on a few ways the U.S. was structured in the early days. But what they did was each region or factory or city gets its own Soviet, right? Its own council. And anyone there can stand for that Soviet, can put themselves up for election or be nominated or whatever. They have a vote, right? They create this council, and then that council, out of them and all the others like them, goes to the next level up. So the level of one of our states or a province or what they call an oblast there. And then from that oblast, they go to the next level up, and then the next level up all the way to what they call the Supreme Soviet. And then from there, you get the entire state political structure of the Soviet Union, incredibly democratic. We're just told it's not, you know?
Got it. You have any questions, Sabby?
Not so far.
Okay.
Definitely a learning experience, though. Jaybe and I had a long conversation about Stalin before this stream. I think it was a couple nights ago. We had a long conversation about this.
I bet we used one of Stalin's books actually as a textbook in the class Jaybe took of mine. So he's probably been on some Stalin lately. When I first started reading Stalin, you couldn't stop me. He's such a good writer. He's so straightforward, to the point. He comes from a working class background himself, by the way, and he was part of an oppressed minority before the revolution. So him rising to power is a very, very Soviet thing.
So somebody said Holodomor. I've heard people talk about this and debunk this on TikTok, including you, Eddie. People talking about the Holodomor. So can we just go over that real quick, just like 2 minutes?
I think maybe if we're going to talk about the Great Leap Forward later, I can do that. And I think Holodomor is probably Noah's better than me.
Okay. All right.
Pass
cool.
to him.
I can go over it. So we touched on it earlier, right? There, in the early Soviet Union, and in the early 30s, they were so far behind the West, right? And they knew they were going to be invaded again. They didn't know when exactly, but they saw fascism rising. They saw, even the Black Hundreds in their own country. From day one, they're invaded by over a dozen imperialist countries. Then there's a civil war. And you have, this comes out of sort of, before the revolution, there was what was called the Stolypin land reforms, which was trying to uncollectivize sort of peasant lands that have been collected forever and ever, right? And so they give these specific families, kind of like the westward expansion here in homesteading, except it was only open to specific families, right? So they give them all this land and say, you go out there, you do what you want with it. These become what's called the kulaks, right? Or Stalin at one point called them the Soviet bourgeoisie, right? And there are these people who owned this land that just had more, or better resources on it than others, right?
They were just the bigger farmers in the area.
Exactly.
They owned the land.
And they get to a point where they can afford better farming implements, etc., and start leasing them out to peasants, right? And this creates a big old antagonism, especially after the revolution. And they have all this industrialization going on, etc. And then a sort of shortage starts hitting. And the kulaks use this to hoard grain, right? Beginning to starve people in the cities while they're charging the state, who's the only one buying it, about a 400% markup. And so they start requisitioning this from them and then just start taking it because people are starving. This is one part, right? Another part is throughout collectivization, which was the process that begins at a grassroots level of these peasants getting together and collectively farming, starting these collective farms, that the state then ends up supporting, right? You have the kulaks sabotaging this. This escalates into violence over and over and over again. Finally, the state and the Communist Party send people to help. And they obviously come down on the side of the collective farms. Just to give you an idea of how they originally tried to begin, though, what they did wasn't to sort of start going out and killing kulaks, right? They incentivized creation of new collective farms by giving subsidies, by giving free seed, et cetera, et cetera. And the rate of collective farming is sort of like they covered maybe 15% of the grain sales in 1930, I want to say. By 33, it was 80%, right?
Kind of like co-op farming, like something like that. Okay.
Precisely what it is. What this was on a theoretical level, and this was Stalin's sort of point, was this was a transition to a socialist way of doing things for people that had a more peasant mindset, a social consciousness coming out of that sort of stratum of society, right? But anyway, this shortage hits, and kulaks begin, as they're sort of getting their farms taken by the grassroots movement, slaughtering their own livestock, burning their grain, leaving it to rot, etc. After this, there were less than half of the livestock in the Soviet Union than there was previous. So they killed in order to just drive up prices and prevent their private property being collectivized, over half the livestock in the entire country.
So it's basically like if we can't have it, nobody can.
Exactly. It was taking my ball and going home, right? It was crazy. But lastly, this wasn't a huge thing, right? It wasn't this giant famine with millions dying. It wasn't. There were shortages, there were deaths, right? But it's a lot more complicated than that, than just, giant murderous commies or whatever.
And
right?
what's interesting is a lot of people wish Stalin would have gone in right away and put a stop to the kulaks, but he kept trying to do things the nice way. So it's actually, he was less dictatorial than he's made out to be.
Exactly.
And some have argued that he should have been more authoritarian.
And so we get the stories of this here through Hearst and the Hearst media machine, right? And if you look into Holodomor, like there's a book on it by anti-communists called "Why Is One Holocaust Worse Than the Other?" where they downplay the actual Holocaust, by the way, talking about the alleged millions of Jews killed by the Nazis and all kinds of horrible stuff. But if you track that or any other book on this back to the primary sources, you get to these Hearst articles. And his main source on this, which was a guy named, I believe his name is Thomas Walker, who took these photos throughout what he said was his time in the Soviet Union, right? He was there for maybe 2 weeks. He all of the photos that he supposedly had, you can look these up on a Google image search, were actually photos of earlier famines. Like there was an earlier famine in Volga. Some were photos from World War I. There's a story he put out about a man who starved right next to his horse. It was just a picture of a guy next to a dead horse. I don't know why you wouldn't eat the horse. Just weird stuff. He ends up getting arrested for something completely immaterial. By the way, it was, I think, it was a slavery law involving trafficking women across state lines for purposes of sex. This is what he gets arrested for. And all of the lies he told in the Hearst papers come out. So originally, even Americans didn't believe this stuff. It all came out in the trial, right? He got kicked out of the Soviet Union for trying to smuggle in old white guard, the Tsarist soldiers, into a factory to sabotage it. He was fired from 2 jobs there for loafing. He was basically a con man. He'd also been arrested for, I think it was called marriage swindle at the time. This, along with a bunch of Nazis, are the primary sources for the Holodomor, which means mass murder through hunger.
Or Anne Applebaum, who's a Western writer, not a historian, who's been debunked by Robert Conquest and Mark Tauger, who are Soviet agronomists, or one of them's a Soviet agronomist. I don't know what the other one studies, but they're not communists. And they've looked at Applebaum's work and dissected it and debunked it systematically. And I just want to add, the Canadian government now heavily funds these Holodomor education programs where they literally have a Holodomor bus with like Ukrainian genocide painted on the side, and it drives around and tells people that the Holodomor happened and raises awareness for the Holodomor. So it's something that the ruling class has put a lot of money into perpetuating.
Fun fact, real quick, the people in Ukraine who were propagating this myth was the OUN, Stepan Bandera's organization, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the party that was so extreme in their anti-Semitism and pogroms that the German Nazi party, when they got to Ukraine during the war, were like, dude, you guys got to chill on this anti-Semitism. They were that extreme. These are the progenitors of the modern neo-Nazis in Ukraine.
That tea is delicious. Wow.
I know. That was a lot.
Wow.
Oh, man.
Woo. Wow. That's really interesting. So as far as Stalin, we covered some of him. I want to move on to Mao, because a lot of times people will look at Mao and they'll say, oh my God, he murdered a bunch of people. And then you find out that some of them were landlords, and you kind of was like, okay. So, like, So can you give us a little, can you guys give us a little bit of background about the claims about Mao being some massive, horrible Chinese dictator? I know it's a yellow peril type of BS. So let's just debunk some of that.
Yeah, interestingly, a lot of the people were landlords, but not even landlords like we think of in America, because like I said, China was a semi-feudal country. So they had these like dictatorial feudal lords who owned the land and like lorded over the people and would torture the people and exploit the peasants for their labor for years and years and years and years. And it wasn't Mao who ordered the execution of them. It was the people who had been subjugated by these landlords for years who were like, no, we're not letting them go. We're going to kill some of these. And they executed like over 100 of them. But it was the peasants who wanted to do it, not Mao. Now, China needed to go ahead with these industrialization projects because they wanted to industrialize agriculture and move forward towards a modernized mode of production. So Mao launched what's called the Great Leap Forward, which is where you saw like these things like the backyard furnaces, which became notorious in the West. They were mocked by Western propagandists. Mao tried to set up all these furnaces in people's backyards so they could make steel. Look at all these stupid Chinese people. They don't know how to make steel like us Americans. They're so dumb. But what they were doing with those backyard furnaces were teaching the peasants to work with steel, teaching the peasants to work with industry, because they didn't know. 80% of the country was feudal before that. It was people who worked the land under landlords. They don't know anything about steel, nor do they have industry to produce steel, so that needed to be developed. So the backyard furnaces and the quotas put on them were to teach the peasantry how to work with industry and start producing industry. Now, at this time, the economy was highly centrally planned. It was very top down. And Deng Xiaoping, who would go on to take over China after Mao, was arguing for a less centralized, a little bit more decentralized, less centrally planned economy that would allow for more private markets, similar to Lenin's new economic policy in the Soviet Union. So he argued for that. Now, there were famines during this time, right? Because, as we said, they were a feudal country. They were not industrialized. They were isolated by the Western nations. And there were horrible weather conditions in the first few years of the revolution that led to some famines. Now, Deng Xiaoping, in his campaign to take over the Communist Party of China, which he was democratically elected for, contrary to what you hear in the West, he was saying, my economic policies, my policies that would have been more similar to Lenin's policies in the Soviet Union and less top down, would have ameliorated the effects of the famine. There would have been less people who died in the famine if we would have gone with my policies instead of Mao. He still loved Mao. He still supported Mao. He was still part of the party and fought in the Revolutionary War with Mao. But he was arguing that my policies would have been even better than Mao's. And that's why we need to go ahead with reform and opening up, which is what they did and what created the modern China that we see today, the most advanced civilization in the world. But so he went on a campaign saying that, like, I can't remember what the exact number is. I talk about it in my video on the construction of modern China, but in his campaign, he said this many people died in the famine, less people would have died under me. So what Western historians do then is they take what Deng was saying in that campaign and they extrapolate from data and say Mao starved 40 million people, which is literally like taking the number of people Deng was saying starved during the famines and timesing it by 100. Like, it wasn't even close to that. And they'll use that against Mao. They'll say, look, people in his own party were saying that he was starving the people, but that's not what people within the Communist Party of China were saying. There was just a debate about how to run the economy. How do we run this socialist experiment? How do we go from a mostly feudal country where everyone's peasants to an industrialized superpower and what we see in China today, which is the most advanced country in the world, completely industrialized. They've abolished relative poverty. It's the first 10 years of Mao. There were famines at first, but it is the fastest increase in human life expectancy that has ever been seen in human history. And it's never been replicated. It was even faster than the Soviet Union. The way they increased literacy and decreased malnutrition and ultimately increased people's standard of living was incredible. But what the Western press does is what they always do: hyper focus on the people who died in the famines, psychoanalyze Mao to say he created these famines on purpose because he's such a bad guy, even though we have no evidence for this, and then just ignore all the incredible advancements that were made in China at the time.
That's what it always comes down to. I mean, any history of any communist country, there are amazing things that they're able to do, especially the small ones, because they're so easily blockaded by our own ruling class, especially Cuba, right? They tried to kill Fidel Castro, was it over 600 times?
Yeah.
You have to have the level of your people for your intelligence apparatus to just be that loyal, right? To that they never let you down. They can never get to you like that. But there are so many achievements that they just spin, just like any other media spin. They used to do this during the nuclear talks in the late Soviet Union. Right? Anything the Soviets would say, they would spin it negatively. So the U.S. would make an absurd demand. They would say, okay, no, we can't do that. What do you really want? And then they would say, oh, they're refusing to cooperate. Right? It's things like that. I mean, in the Soviet Union, they industrialized faster than anything else in history. There's a book by William Z. Foster called Towards Soviet America. The entire first half of it covers everything they don't tell you about the achievements of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. So now we are sort of, looking at China modern day. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up, and this is something I noticed whenever I read about socialist countries, is that whenever socialist countries, whenever the people, the proletariat come into power, one of the first things that usually changes is the literacy rates. It usually goes up whenever I see anything about socialist society. So whether it's the Soviet Union, whether it's the People's Republic of China, whether it is Cuba, Vietnam, places like that, the literacy rates always go up. Now, if anybody knows anything about American history, is that who was suppressed and who made it illegal for Black people to be able to read and write?
Yep.
So my fifth great grandfather died knowing how to read and write, but he didn't know how to read and write when he was little. And he was born in the 1790s. So that just goes to show that it's really more of a people center, because if we all know that knowledge is power, and if you want people to have power, then you want people to know how to read and write too. Now,
if you want people to have power.
Now, Sabs, let me ask you this. What is the average grade level, reading grade level in the United States? I think you know this fact.
I think I have to double check. Is it third grade?
I think it's sixth.
Sixth grade.
It's sixth grade now? Okay. Well, things have improved a little bit. I remember at one point, seriously, I remember at one point it was like third grade. But the thing is, like the literacy, I know when I did my observations in K through 12, that was what, at least this is in Massachusetts, so just keep that in mind. That was a heavy focus, was reading and writing. They spent most of the day learning reading and writing because of the literacy rate issue in the United States. Because I remember I was just like, where's the math? When are they going to learn math? Those kinds of things. But most of the time was spent reading and writing. So, but that's still sad.
I live in Cleveland, which is the poorest big city in the country. On the east side where I'm from, I think there's a 93% adult illiteracy rate.
Here's something
ridiculous.
Here's some interesting too. And when the Soviet Union was occupying Afghanistan, there was tons of propaganda out about that in the West. Most people look at it as an aggressive, violent Soviet occupation, but they were trying to stabilize the country, which had a lot of extremist groups and warlords, and help this Marxist democratic government take power and modernize Afghanistan. They had all these ideas about rights for women and teaching people to read and equal access to education. So the Soviet Union, when they occupied, they were helping launch these literacy campaigns where they were sending social workers even into the rural, most, quote unquote, backwards regions of Afghanistan and teaching people to read. So what the U.S. started doing in response was heavily funding and arming Osama bin Laden, the Mujahideen extremist jihadist groups, and other extremist jihadist groups in and around Afghanistan. And what they would do was hide in Pakistan. And when literacy workers would come to the rural areas, they would cross the border and throw acid in their faces, which was, part of their ideology, which was anti-woman and anti-women, leaving the house and educating themselves. So that's what the Soviet Union was doing in Afghanistan, teaching people to read, while the U.S. was funding terrorists to throw acid on the faces of literacy workers. Really shows you where their intentions lie.
That whole thing was literally provoked by our CIA in the first place. There was a rapidly growing communist movement in Afghanistan at the time. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the head of the CIA at the time, wrote about this in his book, The Great Chessboard. He said his whole plan was to get the Soviets there and the revolutionaries in Afghanistan to force them to move before they were ready, which is exactly what they did. The whole thing was to, quote, give the Soviets their Vietnam, get them in this country where they can spin them as the aggressors and where they can't leave until something really catastrophic happens. Kind of like what they're doing to Russia right now.
Got it. So
I was going to say one of the things I think that hurt the literacy rate too was, I don't know if everybody, Jaybe, do you remember having to read out loud in class?
Yeah.
Do you remember having to do that? So some schools they went away from that because they said that it can embarrass. I know, don't get me started. They went away from that because they said that it can embarrass students that may not have, the best reading level, or students that may have anxiety, et cetera. But I wonder about that. And I wonder if that's why when we were growing up, maybe that's why the literacy rates were higher, because we had to do that in school. Like we had to read aloud. And so moving away from that, I wonder how many kids sometimes sit in the classroom and they pretend like they're reading, but they're not.
Yeah.
Our entire education system isn't designed to teach us. It's designed to train us to be people they can exploit, right? We're not there to really learn and understand. We're there to pass a test so we can buy a piece of paper from the bank to go get a job where we're going to spend the vast majority of our waking hours making somebody else rich.
Yeah. It's funny because I actually enjoy. Okay, it's kind of funny. I'm a contradiction because I hated reading, but I love reading out loud because I was good at it, right? Hell, I read on my channel. So for me, it's like, well, duh, of course you got to read out loud, because there's a difference between reading in your head and reading out loud. And reading out loud is more of a skill, because when you read out loud, then that means that you actually have to use inflections in your voice, sense state, modulation, things like that. And so because of the way I was raised, and I actually enjoyed reading out loud. But as Jessica Mai said, she said for her it was anxiety inducing.
Yep.
So I understand that for some people it's like, yeah, but I think it should be more on a volunteer basis. Like, who wants to read out loud? You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Some people, should be encouraged to do so. And if people who get anxiety for it, then it's like, okay, then you don't have to. But my thing is, like, the education system is really a good synopsis of telling the type of government that you have and who they prioritize the most. Because if they're not prioritizing everyone having education, especially an equality in education and equity in education, then that means that they really just don't care about the people. And just as an aside, for anybody who does not know any of the lingo, proletariat basically means the working masses or anyone equal to the working masses, correct?
Yes, wage laborers, specifically people who sell their labor in a market because they don't have access to means of production. Working masses could be a more general term that could include like lumpen elements or the peasantry in certain countries, but yeah.
We tend to use working classes, like plural, to include what we call the reproletariat.
Okay.
But as you learned in the class, it's always part of the contradiction, right? Like, proletariat arises in different forms, in different periods, according to different characteristics. But the main thing is that it is these people that, like Eddie was just saying, work for a wage, but are prevented from doing anything other than buying means of consumption, things they immediately use, paying your rent, buying food, etc. We're unable to accumulate any forms of wealth of our own and stability. When we do that, we lose our proletarian character and begin entering the middle classes. That's a whole another bag of bananas, though.
I was hoping you say bag of bananas. Yes, got it out of him. Okay, so I want to move on to Cuba. Now, this country has been demonized to no end. I live in Florida, and everybody's like, oh my God, Castro, he's a horrible person, human being. Now, this is something that me and Sabby talked about, and I just want to get it from y'all because this is what I heard. Ready? Cuba is a very largely black country. And yet, a lot of the Cubans that fled communism in Cuba, are white Cubans. Interesting. Care to elaborate?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no one who benefited more from the revolution than the Afro-Cubans. The Cubans who had been brought over, had been stolen from Africa, and had been mistreated for years.
I'm y'all guys.
Yeah, it's like what George Galloway says, like in Venezuela and Cuba, like the darker the skin tone, the more likely they are to support the revolution. And I mean, if like one of my favorite wrestlers, Mijan Lopez Nunez, he's probably the greatest Greco-Roman wrestler in world history. He is a big black guy who, you know, if you think about it, in pre-1959 Cuba, he would have been working on a plantation his whole life, making money for Western plantation owners who are exploiting the crap out of Cuba. Now he's a 4-time Olympic champion and one of the greatest athletes ever. So think about all the potential of the Afro-Cuban community that the revolution unlocked by just giving them, you know, a basic standard of life and not forcing them to do plantation labor.
Yeah, this is the part about, I remember I did have to write a paper about Castro in undergrad. And this is the part I feel like a lot of people just aren't aware of because of the propaganda in the schools. Like we're taught that Castro was this brutal dictator, awful person. So we can go on and on. Same thing about the Black Panthers. We were taught it was a militant group in school. They didn't teach us about the Black Panthers doing mutual aid or the breakfast program, none of those things. But I think that it is important that people hear the other side of it and not just the Castro was this dictator who silenced people in Cuba part.
That's really, really important. You know, it's funny. Even nowadays, they even try to use the race issue in a new way. They say, "Oh, the communists in Cuba, they're racist towards Black Cubans, just like Americans," which is clearly not the case. But it's weird. I grew up on the east side of Cleveland, right, which is majority Black. I went to a majority Black high school. We learned about the Black Panthers in our school, but we were told that they were a, quote, Black power organization that wanted to oppress white people. What?
Nothing could be further from the truth. Like they worked with some questionable white organizations to build solidarity for the working class. That's ridiculous.
Actually, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, called Fred Hampton the most dangerous man in America because he was a man at 21 years old who could unite the Black liberation movement, the communist movement, and the peace movement. And you did that, and you have a revolution. I mean, we're not taught about any of these, Chris. We're not taught about the Communist Party, who was the first integrated political organization in the entire country, who began the Council for Civil Rights. We're not taught about the real W.E.B. Du Bois, who we at the Institute call the father of American Marxism. We're not taught any of that revolutionary history. We're given even like a watered down version of Black history, when it's such an integral part of our nation's sort of becoming what it is today.
I think part of the reason why a lot of people may not realize that the majority of Cuba is that way, JB, is because of mainstream media and the entertainment business. If you notice, and this isn't just like a Cuba issue, you'll notice this in India as well. You'll notice this in Thailand. Like a lot of times, if you watch movies or TV shows where the character is Cuban or is, you know, Indian or, you know, is, well, Indian, Thailand, Asian, what they'll do is they tend to use the lighter skin people for those roles. That happens often with the Cuban roles that you see in Hollywood, the Bollywood movies. If you watch those, it's the same thing. But if you actually go to those countries, you realize, wait a minute, most of the people don't look like this.
Yeah,
And you'll see it a lot.
I remember. Okay, so I'm gonna be a little bit vulnerable right now, but I remember one time I was shooting my shot with this Indian dude, and he was darker than me. I was just like, "All right, what's up?" You know, we were corresponding back and forth. He was fine as hell, but still, the thing is that a lot of people from these areas. Sorry, guys, but you know, all straight people around me. But the thing is that, you know, it's just you realize that there's a lot of people that are like darker. Like for instance, like what you were saying. People even in Mexico, look at the telenovelas. They're all, you know, they're all paper towel colored. So the thing is that they're out there, but at the same time, it's like the majority of people are, you know, darker skinned because of the racist aspect. I want to share this as well because I think this is going to make everybody on this panel smile, because I smile. I wanted to smile when I saw it. Here you go. You have Fidel Castro meeting and having a conversation with Malcolm X.
Mm-hmm.
If you are a black person and you have respect for somebody like Malcolm X, I want you to think about why the United States demonizes Cuba so much, and why we as black people, especially, we should be looking at Palestinians in a different way. We should be looking at Cubans in a different way. We should be looking at China in a different way. We should be looking at the Soviet Union in a different way, not the way that they want us to look at them. And we should also be looking at socialism and communism in a different way, because that's rich in our history, right? One of the things that gets talked about, and I know, Noah, you bring this up, was the great Paul Robeson. And what did Paul Robeson say about visiting the Soviet Union, if you can refresh my memory?
Do you remember, Eddie, off the top of your head?
It was the first time that he felt like a full man, because he was given full rights. He had his rights written into the Constitution. They couldn't be ripped from him arbitrarily. He wasn't treated like a second-class citizen by the people or by the security forces or police forces. Unlike, of course, we know what was going on in the U.S. at that time with horrible racism systemically and interpersonally. So
I think that's something that we're often, like, we're never given this context of, we're told all these evil things about the Soviets, right? At the time, all these evil things were going on that are really just very normal things. America was an apartheid state, right? This was the era of Jim Crow and segregation. The USSR banned racism, made it illegal, punishable by death in a lot of cases.
Wow.
Like, they did not mess around with that stuff. It was all about trying to get the working people working together in harmony. And over the years, this really begins snowballing, you know?
Wow.
People have like different experiences, or black people have had different experiences when they live in other countries. Even today, you know, it's just, it's different. Like Nico was talking about the difference living in Brazil. Like now, like compared to living in the United States, it's just a very different, because I guess also like Brazil, if you think about it, a lot of people there look like Nico.
Yeah.
For the most part, you know, so it's different, but.
Well, another fact is that Brazil is the country with the highest African population in the Western Hemisphere.
There you go.
They got more black people in Brazil than the United States.
This is something I'm sure Jaybe could explain after the class, but where does our social consciousness and ideological sort of assumptions about how the world works come from? It comes from the economic base, how our society goes about being society. One of the big sort of things our ruling class gets wrong is that racism created slavery. But from the Marxist view, it's slavery that created racism. And this is unique in the U.S. context, right? In the Soviet Union, they didn't have this super brutal form of chattel slavery that we had here. So them experiencing this sort of advance of race relations at such a rapid pace just makes sense. The people weren't held back for a couple hundred years because of that, you know?
The Bolsheviks had to combat anti-Semitism, I believe, was the main problem of bigotry that was existing at the time, which was rampant across all of Europe and Eurasia. But
it's one of the reasons my grandparents loved the communists so much. They're Jews. They actually converted to Eastern Orthodoxy in order to hide from pogroms.
Well, one thing I was going to say, speaking of Castro died when he was 90 years old in 2016. And I'm actually surprised he lived that long because there were many attempts to assassinate Castro.
Yeah, they actually tried to literally get him with an exploding cigar, like a cartoon.
Some of the most ridiculous.
Like in Looney Tunes?
It's like a cartoon. There was also one where he liked to like go diving, or like snorkeling, and they wanted to set up like a barnacle that would explode if he swam up to it. Just like these ridiculous plans. But unfortunately, they did kill Che Guevara, who's another figure in Cuba. He's up on my clock there next to the photo of my head.
Yep.
But he's often demonized by Western propagandists. But if you look into the history of Che Guevara, you will never find somebody in human history who embodied the communist ethic or the struggle of the working class more than Che Guevara. Dude literally dedicated his life to it. The only reason the U.S. got him was because after the revolution in Cuba, he said, I'm going to go to the Congo and start a revolution there. It didn't work out. He's like, okay, I'm going to go to Bolivia and help with the revolution there. And that's when the CIA was finally able to track him down and kill him, where his last words were, shoot, coward, you're only killing a man. But an absolute Chad of the socialist struggle. Yeah.
The rest of that quote's just as beautiful. He says, the revolution lives on, the idea lives on.
Wow.
Yeah, we talk a lot about...
Really quick too. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I don't mean... I'm terrible with interrupting. I was just saying, we talk a lot about how we should sort of conduct ourselves as communists at the Institute. I wrote an article about it a while ago called Walking the Walk. But Che did this. Like these things we say we should be doing, Che was this. He's often underrated as a Marxist theorist, but he was absolutely brilliant with his theory as well. He has a theory they called the New Socialist Man, and how to create this new sort of higher level of social consciousness. It's really, really good if anyone's interested in reading after this.
For any of the LGBTQ people that may be watching, also from what I've heard, they actually apologize for how they treated queer people as well, multiple times, because they realized that they were wrong in that. I think it was Fidel Castro's niece, I think it's Mariela Castro. She was actually also very integral into realizing liberation for people who are queer as well in Cuba. And I'll be getting into that in a second. But I just wanted to share this video right now. This is Castro arriving in Harlem in New York. And he was greeted with cheers.
Castro! Bienvenido! He's a nice man. He's a beautiful man. Yeah. Okay, all right, okay. Es un mensaje para el pueblo de Harlem.
Dejarle mi eterno cariño por lo que hicieron por nosotros aquella vez. Hace 35 años. Cuando no teníamos un parar en Nueva York.
I wish I understood Spanish. This isn't subtitled though. But it just basically goes to show how a lot of people really, really appreciated, people like him. So, yeah.
There's
So here's
Angela Davis back when she used to be radical.
yeah.
In Harlem, the historical memory of Fidel having met in the Teresa Hotel with Malcolm is still so much a part of Harlem culture that when I heard that he was planning to visit Harlem, I said, no matter where I am, anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, I will definitely try to be in Harlem.
Welcome to the Abyssinian Baptist Church, where we believe in truth and in justice and equality, and where we join with you in saying, Cuba, yes, blockade, no. God bless you.
I think this is what scares a lot of the corporate dictators. I think this scares them. Yeah. So,
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's like we know they lie about people like Malcolm X and black freedom fighters who were in Harlem and socialists and revolutionaries here in the U.S. So, of course, they're going to lie about our comrades abroad. Of course, they're going to lie about socialists internationally. And that's why I see it as kind of a betrayal to the international socialist movement when you have American Western socialists living within the comfort of the empire who are like F Cuba, F Che, F, all our Cuban comrades who are struggling for socialism. Like, you're buying into the bourgeois narratives about them rather than listening to the working classes of the world.
Yeah, that's something that I think we should really try to understand as one of the most important things. They are always, always, always going to give us different excuses for why we should break solidarity with each other, with people internationally, whatever it is. There's different excuses, right? They'll say, how could you want to ally with the working class in Cuba? Don't you know Che Guevara was homophobic? Right? Like, well, maybe, but he was a man of his time. What are they like right now? That's what's important. How has that progressed since then?
But so was people like Jefferson. Like, are we going to sit here and go, well, Jefferson was a great man? I'm like, he had slaves. Like, what? So my thing is, I was like, okay, yes, of course. But the thing is that a lot of people were homophobic back then. But a lot of them had changed their tune, especially later on. People still evolve and grow, and
we. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but we've talked about how in America we inherited all of these racist attitudes from slavery, from the slave mode of production, and in Russia after the revolution, they inherited all these anti-Semitic attitudes that then needed to be combated. And in Cuba, they inherited a lot of homophobic attitudes from what's called in Latin and Central America, machismo. This idea that it's wrong to be feminine, or it's wrong to not have this masculine sort of presence about you. And that has been combated since by the revolution. As you said, they've apologized for it, and now they're for liberation for different communities and different sexualities. And it's something that the revolution kind of had to course correct. And we're not saying any socialist experiment is perfect, but they're experiments. And if you look at them in comparison to the capitalist societies, they're much, much better on almost every level.
Yep.
Yeah. I actually wanted to share this as well because this came out in 2022. And I've showed this before, but I have a larger audience on. I'm going to make sure I show this again. So this actually was passed, and it's called the Cuban Family Code Law. And so a lot of people really need to be abreast of what's going on there. Did I make this too large? Let me go down one. Okay. So it actually talks about how this new family code law is actually, it says, the most inclusive, progressive, and revolutionary law in Latin America, indeed the world, because of who it protects. So it says the family code, which passed by referendum on September 25th, so that's in a few days, so it have been a year. It says Cuban Constitution defines what families can be and guarantees equality for all types of family structures. It says Cuba is now one of 33 countries that recognize same-sex marriage, and one of roughly a dozen where LGBT discrimination is illegal. And so it says important provisions in the Cuban Family Code now legally protect families regardless of their makeup. People in vulnerable situations, such as those with motor, sensory, or mental health disabilities, unpaid youth, women, victims of domestic violence, and LGBT people, and all races, genders, and sexual orientations. The law gives support to institutions that protect families, home workers, and youth. It provides rights to anyone wanting to adopt or raise a child, and to non-commercial surrogate mothers, and provisions for family mediation. So this, and the thing is that it was a massive undertaking. It says a large percentage of Cubans, 74%, took part in the vote. They actually won with over 65% of the vote for this referendum. So this was massive, including gay marriage and things like that. And just to let people know, if anybody says anything, oh, Eddie had to leave. Thanks, Eddie.
I killed him. Sorry.
No, you didn't.
Carlos and I joke every time we used to do videos. Whenever he wasn't around, we'd always get, "Where's Eddie? Where's Eddie?" And we'd say like, "Oh, we have him tied up in the basement or whatever."
Oh my God, you killed Kitty, bastards!
It's a big deal, and it's sad because these type of things should just be bog standard. Like, we shouldn't even have to have a law about this, right?
Yeah.
It should just be how it is.
Yeah. And so just to let anybody know, also, you guys can actually read this in the National Institute of Health, where Cuba actually made gender-affirming care, medically gender-affirming care, legal, and they started instituting it back in the early 2000s so that transgender people can get transgender-affirming care in Cuba. And because they have free healthcare, they don't have to crowdfund for that type of care. So just letting you guys know that as well. That's how progressive Cuba is. Cuba is more socially and economically progressive than the United States. So when people talk about, oh my God, communism is so horrible. Well, why is it that people, especially the most disenfranchised, are doing great in countries like Cuba? I think that's something that people need to really ask the question about.
That's right.
Let me share this.
Well, it's
they
like,
have a longer life expectancy than we do in the U.S. too.
They do, as of like 10 years ago too, like a while ago. You know what I really, really like about the entire LGBT thing in Cuba is that it isn't this topic of division the way it is here, because they don't have our corporate media, right, that pits people against each other. They just have the media there who tells it like it is. And so they don't have this giant, like, everyone hating each other based on these wild distortions and all that about this, which we do here. And it's a giant impediment to class struggle many times,
Mm-hmm. Like, Here's the crazy part. Did you guys know that there are state-owned gay bars in Cuba?
Mm-hmm. State-owned?
State-owned gay bars in Cuba.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because New Hampshire does have state-owned liquor stores.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They're the only place I know that has it, but it was kind of weird for me the first time I went there, and I was like, "What do you mean the state owns the liquor store?"
Yeah.
It was different.
They have that in Pennsylvania too. I lived in Pittsburgh for a while. They have the state store, they call it.
Oh, that's
cool.
interesting.
Yeah. But you know, so that's things. You know, it's really interesting. You know, about Cuba, and so when it comes to, and I know I'm kind of focused on the identity aspect of it, but this just goes to show that when it comes to the communist or Marxist view of liberating people, it's liberating people so that they can be the most authentic version of themselves as long as it doesn't harm other people. And that's the point. And so I just wanted to say that as well. Um, I'm looking at, okay. So Roger Meadows, thank you so much for the super chat. He says, why did we turn around and make Soviet Union an enemy post World War II? Good question. Thank you.
They were always the enemy of our ruling class. Originally, our ruling class wanted to stay out, right? But when the Soviet Union tried to get us to do a mutual defense pact with them against the fascists, they turned them down flat, right? When that was no longer an option, the U.S. came in at the very, very, very end of the war. I mean, 80% of the fighting was done on the Eastern Front, and 90% of it was done by the Soviets. The Soviets took over 20 million casualties, 20 million people murdered by the Nazis invading. I think the U.S. is a tiny, tiny fraction of that. Not to diminish the U.S.'s role at Normandy or anything like that, you know, but they were always the major enemy. Our ruling class hoped the Nazis would destroy the communists for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so very much, Sebastian, for the super sticker. Appreciate it very much as well. Interesting from Cobra Commander. He says Stalin asked for help numerous times to stop Germany and America, and the UK refused or ignored him every single time until he did the Ribbentrop Pact.
Interesting. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, they asked all of the Western powers. And Eddie did a really good video on this where he explains the role Czechoslovakia played. And basically, the Soviets knew the Nazis were coming, right? They knew. So the narrative that we get told that, oh, actually, the communists were allied to the Nazis, not the case. They were desperately trying to buy time because every expert in the entire world was saying that the Nazis were going to exterminate them. That was their stated goal. Exterminate and enslave the Slavs, exterminate all of the Jews. So by the time they're trying to get ready. And if you can sign a piece of paper that they knew the Nazis would break, you do it. You know, that's really what happened. Wow. After all the Western powers turned them down first, by the way.
Yeah, I heard Churchill was a bastard.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
So one of the most horribly racist people.
Yes, yes. He was another one too that they really wanted him to step down like earlier on. But it took him forever to refuse to do so. He was one of those people that didn't feel like it was time for him to part ways.
Mizu said Hitler thought the Slavs were too mixed.
Yeah, the Slavs, like you gotta understand the way races are thought of in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, and going into the whole Western continental Europe is very different, or was at the time. Like my grandma, who was a Kazakh, she's a Tatar living from Kazakhstan, right? Hated Polish people. To her, Polish people were a race, right? Not black and white, because everybody was either brown like my grandpa or white like her. So there wasn't like the same notions we get that come down to us through chattel slavery over there. And so the Nazis, believing their race, the Aryans, were superior to everyone else, Didn't consider the Russians, who were the Muscovites or Slavs, which actually the word slave comes from the word Slav, by the way. Didn't consider them as human as the Aryans were. So that's why they had no problem exterminating them.
Got it.
Wow.
Let me do this. Marvin says Russia never gets any credit for World War II contribution. If it wasn't for Russia, Nazis would have owned.
Yeah, that's another thing there too. That piece right there.
Yeah,
it's important for people to know.
Mm-hmm. So just to close things out, what is one more thing that you would want people to know regarding communist leaders, especially in communists? I wanted to get also into Kim Il Sung, but we didn't have enough time. But as far as some of the misconceptions, because honestly, I think that a lot of people should subscribe to Midwestern Marx, and there's a lot of other people who are Marxists that you guys recommend that would be able to do that. So, what are some of your final thoughts regarding Marx, communist leaders?
Well, honestly, I don't know a lot about Kim Il Sung. I know more about Ho Chi Minh. If we're talking about other communist leaders, but really, what we should do is take a step back and think about how we're told things and what that means. So what happens is preconceptions are created for us by the institutions that are built, owned, and run by our ruling class. And then they sort of give us vague narratives that, if you don't think about them, confirm that preconception. All of it is designed to get us to shut down our critical thinking, not verify what we're reading. Don't just check and see if something has a source. Look and see if what that source says is what it's telling you. When it comes to communist countries, communist leaders, it's never going to happen. Like, I've done this work for a lot of stuff. Stephen Kopkin, anti-communist historian who wrote about Stalin. I checked 30 of his citations. In one book, most of them added up. In his second book, none of them did. Right? You gotta verify what we're being told in our era. And the only other advice I would give is from Lenin. Mm-hmm. He says that people will always be the victims of deception and self-deception in politics until we learn to search for the specific class interest behind every phrase, every slogan, and every piece of political rhetoric. He tells us to ask the question, cui bono, who benefits? Think materially, not just in the sort of vague realm of morality. Think materially, who really benefits?
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so very much for that. So just to go over this last, we have a super sticker. Thank you so very much to DJ Adam. And Future Homestead says you guys need to have Carlos on to talk about the purity fetish. So yeah, we'll talk about that. So Carlos, what can they? I'm sorry. Noah, sorry. Where can they find you?
Everybody can find us at midwesternmark.com. Our Twitter is at marksmidwest. Patreon.com/midwesternmarks. And my Twitter personally, if for some reason you like me, I question your judgment in that case, but it's right there.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so very much. And since we're going to be heading out, what do you got going on your show tonight, Sabs?
Cleveland rocks. Cleveland rocks. Cleveland rocks. Ohio. I've been waiting all night to say that. Do you remember that show, Noah?
Drew Carey? Yes, yeah. Of course I'm Cleveland. Of course I do. When I moved to LA, I got 2 questions from everybody I met. One was, what's it like on a farm? because they think all of Ohio is a farm. And 2 was, how often do you hang out with Drew Carey?
Oh man. But yeah, I'll be live at 8 p.m. Eastern time, you guys. Just covering 4 news stories. Yeah.
All right. And before I go, just to let you guys know, this Saturday, we will be doing the damn thing in Orlando. We are doing a mutual aid care package giveaway. If you guys would like to, you guys can meet us at the corner of East Robinson and North Eola Drive in Lake Eola Park. Be there at 9:45 a.m. this Saturday, September 23rd. If you can bring a tote to carry some of the care packages with you, if possible, we will be meeting there and doing a head count for the Orlando Mutual Aid for RB and Revolutionary Blackout Network. I hope to see you all there. I am so excited. So if you guys would like to, please come out. Mutual aid is what's going to help us to raise awareness and class consciousness in this country. I hope to see you all there. I wanted to make sure to get that out there as well. So yeah. Anywho, any last words, guys? Because I'm about to head out.
Bye, everybody.
Cleveland rocks. Cleveland rocks.
Yeah. Rock on, people. Bye-bye. Deuces.